Sounds good, man. Hello, folks. Bill, Brian, and Brandon. Imagine this. We've got Brandon in live. Well, semi-live. Uh,
Brendan. It's
anyway,
Brendan. I'm
Brandon,
calling you
not
Oh,
out. I'm
Brendan.
Brent,
calling you out, Bill. I'm
Brendan,
calling you out.
No.
Brandon, potato, right? We've known each other
And
long enough at
besides,
this point.
well, I think
So
over
if
the
you
last
can't
couple of
understand
years,
my
you've had a lot
accent,
of
Brian,
well, over the last couple of years, if you went by Brandon, you would have had a lot of fans out there. I don't know what that's all about, but a lot of people got behind some guy named Brandon. I don't know who Brandon is, but I don't know. Anyway,
If this was a conspiracy, they'd have to get all those people to lie.
so
I think you'd have
anyway,
to get them to lie. I think they'd
w-
volunteer.
this week we're going to talk a little bit about hurricanes. We're going to talk about heat. We are going to talk about everything weather impacted that is predominantly going to be on natural gas. But let's not forget, there's a ton of refineries in the Gulf Coast. Baton Rouge has 600,000 barrels, New Orleans 1.35, Port Arthur 2.6, Houston 2.7. So if this knocks out refineries, that's another conversation. We're going to stay probably more so on the natural gas side, but I don't want us to forget that there's a lot of refineries. Look at all these dots. So the squares are LNG terminals, and for anybody that doesn't know, this is often considered part of what they call Hurricane Alley. So when we look at marine traffic, which is a great website to look at ships around the globe, all of these are petroleum and LNG ships. And Brendan, correct me if I'm wrong, but oh, no, wrong color. Bill loves when I draw.
Yeah, this is going
So
to be wonderful. You could prepare yourselves because this will be amazing.
this is considered Hurricane Alley. Is that accurate? Something like that?
I think that's a fair assessment. I would also, you don't have to modify your drawing here, Brian. I won't make you do that on the spot, but I would also
No,
incorporate
if it annoys
the.
Bill, I want to do it on the spot.
I would also give a shout out to the Florida Panhandle and along the Gulf Coast of Florida,
Oh, okay.
especially with what we saw last year in Hurricane Milton. That impacted, of course, just to the south there of Tampa. So, yeah, pretty much that entire Gulf Basin is what we're looking for. And I'll even just jump to it, guys. I'll add this part. When we're talking about tropics in terms of who's likely to be impacted first, we'll get to the forecast here in a moment. But, especially early on in the season, we tend to turn our attention to the Caribbean and into the Gulf for that early initiation. And that was the case last year. We had Hurricane Beryl, which was the earliest hurricane to impact the Gulf Basin ever on record, and the strongest hurricane in the Caribbean that early in the season, right around that July period, being a Category 5 before it eventually weakened to a Category 1 by the time it made its impact in the Gulf. So all eyes are on this area here early on this season, and that's really the case over the coming weeks.
Okay. And for
So
those that are looking to cross-reference LNG, 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 and refining, 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 and refining. So if I were to add
and
this up,
petrochemical, brother.
and petrochemical. So when we're talking about impacting demand, LNG exports, which now account for, um, let's see, 14.4 BCF a day, that actually could at full capacity get up to 18 BCF a day. That is 2 BCF a day, probably thrust back into the market. We're probably down $1. So for reference, if we
Yeah.
just have 1%, 10% of an impact, it is going to significantly change natural gas markets. So, and if you're not tracking what supply, demand, imports, exports, um, go to energyrogue.com, sign up for Rogue Radar. This page refreshes every single day that gives an executive summary, technical analysis, fundamental weather, economic CFTC, LNG, news and sentiment, Fibonacci levels. And on the news and sentiment, this analyzed 105 articles to get that assessment. So this is utilizing AI in a great way, and something that that we've worked on with Brendan, not Brandon, even though I think Brandon has a lot of fans out there, but Brendan we cover population cooling degree days, heating degree days, and all of this will impact the price alongside the big one, which is going to be the Hurricane Alley, right? And I think I pulled this up, Brendan, but this is CSU's forecast. Do you want to walk us through what this exactly means?
Yeah, so each year, Colorado State University puts together this forecast for pretty much the entire hurricane season, and especially for the North Atlantic Basin, but also the Gulf and the Caribbean as well. So I think the important distinction here to call out is when we're talking about, for example, that first parameter there, named storms. Currently from CSU, their forecast is just slightly above average against the 30-year average between 1991 and 2020. Now, just to back up for a second, I myself, as a meteorologist, put a lot of weight into CSU. They actually do put out some pretty credible and reliable forecasts. That being said, it's not the only one that's put out. So we're using CSU as an example, but there is a lot of other consulting companies and weather companies out there doing the exact same thing. So what I tend to do for the sake of the Energy Rogue subscribers is give more of an ensemble, right? And kind of take the average of those and compare against what would be that 30-year normal, just to get a general consensus. And the overall general consensus does align with CSU. So coming back to named storms, though, for a second. When we talk about named storms, we are not saying landfalls. We're only saying storms that are named. So that's the little asterisk there that you want to keep in mind. The main focus when we're talking about impacts or potential impacts to places like the Gulf and the Atlantic Basin, but particularly the Gulf, we want to look back at that CSU chart and really
you could be looking
in,
at a storm that goes that way or something.
Sure. Or you could even have a situation where you have a system out in, say, south of Cuba, right in between the Lesser Antilles, and maybe it doesn't even make landfall in the United States and kind of just dies out in the Gulf, right?
Okay.
We've had that too. Or even somewhere in the Caribbean.
Or it goes or it goes down and comes on as a tropical depression or something like that.
Exactly.
But I'm really hoping we get to 21 named storms. I'm going for the record this year. You know why?
Why is that?
Number 21 will be named Windy. I think it'll be so awesome to have a hurricane named Windy.
Well, last year we had Milton, which was fantastic.
Yeah, but Windy,
from
really,
Office Space,
the weather condition already.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's already a weather condition. So it's like it'd be like I can hardly wait for that.
That makes me hungry for a Frosty, though.
Well, let's hope we get Wendy, and let's hope that Wendy, goes out and kind of becomes a fish storm, right, and just dies out in the ocean, right? No impacts, of course.
Yeah.
So that's the distinction here. But there's another metric I think is really interesting to call out, and that might be somewhat confusing to folks. It's actually been used the last few years and has started to become a little bit more of we'll call it a buzz term, and that is ACE, accumulated cyclone energy. And the best way to describe it from a high level is we're talking about how much energy there is for these storms to feed off of. And again, we're talking really high level conceptual on there.
Okay.
There is an equation behind that, but for the sake of the audience and for the sake of time.
So it's kind of intensity of the storm. Is
how much? Yeah. And really the accumulated portion of it is, if I recall correctly, it's how many storms have impacted the region. And it accumulates, it aggregates how much energy is used. Again, if I'm not misconstruing that, but it is a metric and a parameter that has gained some notoriety and some following here the last few years to really quantify the environment that these storms are in. So, for example, last year, if we were to compare the ACE last year versus, say, the 30-year normal, it was quite active towards the middle of the season, right around August, September, when we had Milton and when we had Helene. So when we say that the ACE is going to be 155 versus 123, that's really calling for again an active year, according to CSU. Now, one other thing I'll add to this that's not mentioned in the table is the reason why these forecasts are slightly bullish. They're not crazy bullish, but they're slightly above normal for a forecast. Is because we are entering into what we call an ENSO neutral. So last year we had El Nino, which tends to not be a pattern favorable for tropical development. It tends to be very bearish. You have a lot of shear, and windstorms don't like shear, turning of the winds. So we don't have that this year. We have an ENSO neutral, meaning that the environment has less shear. So again, I'm throwing a term out, wind shear, meaning turning of the wind. Storms don't like that. Tornadoes do. Hurricanes don't.
Right.
And so when we have less of that, well, that creates a better environment for storms to really ramp up and intensify. And so that's why the forecasts this year are relatively bullish. And we are expecting a pretty active year, not just for the Atlantic Basin, but also for the Gulf.
Okay. So Atlantic Basin and the Gulf are going to be active, and the ACE is higher than in years
normal.
past.
Yeah, and again, feel free, to clean me up if there's anybody out there that wants to correct me on that. But again, ACE is really just meant to quantify the environment.
Well, and by the way, so for those listening out there, if you haven't listened to us before, if you haven't listened to us with Brendan has been knocking it out of the park in terms of weather analysis, and being in the energy industry. I've worked on power desks and natural gas desks over the last 30 some odd years, and we had full-time meteorologists. Brendan is one of the best I've ever seen. So he's been incredibly humble, but he's being sincere. Call me out if you see something different. So that's what we like about Brendan, and that's part of the reason he is the go-to source when it comes to weather, especially regarding energy markets. So
anyway, Brendan, when we talk about it in NZO, what you're talking about, that starts off with the Pacific temperature, right? In the ocean?
That's correct. When we think about like El Nino and La Nina, we're really focused on the Eastern Pacific sea surface anomalies. So the sea surface temperature change over time. And so when we have an ENSO neutral, what that's really saying is it's kind of a mix between El Nino and La Nina. It's kind of the middle child between the two. So if we were thinking about El Nino,
is that the sort of the transition time that we see in going from El Nino to La Nina or La Nina to El Nino?
Exactly. It really does serve as a transition. It doesn't always mean that it's going to then transition to La Nina. It may go right back to El Nino if that's what was prior. So it's not always the case. But when we think about these patterns, right? So El Nino, what typically happens is we have above normal sea surface temperatures, anomalies, right? Change. And that's caused by strong winds that move over top of the water. When you have really strong winds, that causes a lot of upwelling, right? And as a result of that, your water is going to be warmer. Contrast that to La Nina, it's the opposite, right? So we don't really have a lot of that upwelling taking place. And so, the waters tend to be cooler. So that's how we essentially derive those two. And so with ENSO neutral, because our winds are, we don't have a lot of really strong flow over top of the water, right? It's relatively choppy. Well, that means that we don't really have a lot of shear, or we don't anticipate there being a lot of shear against these storms. And that lends to the environment that will likely culminate over the course of the next few months. And just for the sake of going back to ACE, because guys, you know me, I want to make sure that I say this correctly, right? I love my weather terminology, and I want to make sure we get the proper definition. So I was correct. So ACE is used to express the energy used by a tropical cyclone during its lifespan. So over time, if we're increasing ACE, right, as it goes up, we expect that to increase as the season goes on because storms are using energy. And so that equation is adding up the energy usage over time. So the first assumption that I had was correct, not the second. So does that make sense?
Okay.
It's an aggregate metric that is used to summate the energy used by storms over time. So if we see that higher than climatological normal, what that's really assessing is that there's going to be storms that are using up energy, and there's going to be quite a bit of activity, therefore.
Well, and as they build up that energy, one of the key things is that can create damage, and in addition to the damage, that means more downtime. So there's a lot that goes into that. Is that that can take off LNG exports, that can take off refineries, that can take off petrochemical. So we are talking about a significant demand hit. And what that means to energy markets is bearish, because that takes
Right.
down demand. And so your supply demand balance, now all of a sudden you have more supply than for the demand available.
Yep.
So over the years, we've seen this actually reverse. It used to be when we had a lot of Gulf Coast production, and we had a lot of production coming out of the offshore rigs in the Gulf Coast. We'd see a hurricane as a supply uh, event. And now that we
Right.
don't have near that, most of the stuff's on. Now, because of the electricity that will go down because of this, it's now a demand event. And so it's really sort of changed over the last 20 some odd years to
Right.
where it impacts the demand. And when you think about how much electricity is used in the Gulf Coast, you just think Texas and Florida alone. Once you start causing power outages there, you'll see demand decrease go down for natural gas, and since you can't pump any gas or diesel, you'll see it go down for crude oil as well. And so one of the things that I was trying to figure, at least get right in my head, as it comes out of the Pacific, usually these are the storms we see driving across Mexico, going up into the United States, if I remember right. Uh, the stronger they are, the more wind shear they cause, the more of a buffer or wall they put up for the hurricanes. If there's less wind shear there, there's less restriction for the hurricane, and the hurricane will spin up faster, spin up stronger, and will have less to keep it from being making landfall. If I understand those storm technology right.
Yeah, and I'll even say this too. There's something of note, right? So in the beginning of the season, we essentially have Saharan dust season, right? So right around June and July, and
Which
even
is
leaking into
crazy, by the
August.
way. Explain that real quick.
Yes.
So
This is like insane to
so
me.
here's how I also understand it. That is really the definition of the butterfly effect, if I remember right. This is what it was always called. That a
Oh, well, let me.
butterfly in Africa started. It's crazy.
Well, let me tell you, the butterfly effect, aka chaos theory, is meteorology as a whole, right? So it's the whole science is pretty much derived from that notion. But no, the Saharan dust season, again, it happens early on, and it primarily impacts the MDR, the main development region, right off the coast of Western Africa in the eastern part of the Atlantic Basin. And usually, all that is just, again, these trade winds that move off of Africa and essentially output dust from the desert in the Saharas. And just like wind shear, tropical systems hate dry air.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the desert? It's dry air. And so a lot of times, if you were to look at a visible satellite of that main development region now, you're likely not going to see much activity. And that makes a lot of sense because it's likely having to do with that dry air intrusion. Right around the middle of August is typically when that ends. But over the last few years, that Saharan dust has been quite potent and intense and has really choked off a lot of activity in the Atlantic Basin as a whole. And so that's why at the beginning of this discussion, I had mentioned that all eyes are on the Gulf and the Caribbean, minus, of course, the Pacific, because of the fact that that's really where we're seeing most of the activity right now. And we'll get to temperature discussion later on, but as high pressure continues to build across the United States, that's only going to ramp up activity in the Gulf. By the way, hey, can you guys tell I'm a little bit rusty today? It's been a while since we've done a live stream because maybe you didn't. I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
Again, you're not rusty. You're not rusty.
Well,
all of it.
Here's what I'll say.
All of it. I'm
Yeah.
trying to soak in. So
That's fair.
If I'm quiet, it's because I'm listening.
No. I it's mostly to myself because the one other thing I'll circle back to as a second correction. Earlier, we were discussing El Nino and La Nina, and I had mentioned about the winds, right? And how we derive those sea surface temperatures. With El Nino, because we have those warmer sea surface temperature anomalies, we don't have much of those trade winds moving across the water. That's why our waters are so hot. In La Nina, that's how we get upwelling, because we have stronger trade winds. That water deep down in the ocean that's cooler is upwelled, and that actually causes those cooler than normal. I may have conflated the two of the trade winds, but wanted to make sure I circle back for the sake of correctness. But all in all, with the tropical weather season, in short, we are expecting an above normal season here at Energy Rogue. I do align myself with some of the forecasts that have been put out there. Again, that ensemble approach of all the different forecasts. And I am expecting our first bit of activity to start in the Gulf. One thing I'm going to add last on the tropics. There has been a lot of noise on social media regarding models. 10 years ago, we didn't have access as much abundance to free weather content like we do now. Brian and Bill, you guys know this from being at the trading desk. That used to be gate kept. That wasn't as widely available in 2002, right? You couldn't get that unless you paid thousands of dollars for the GFS. Now anybody can have it. And as a result of that, anybody can post a model output of a hurricane hitting Florida 2 weeks in advance.
Right.
The GFS and these weather models do very poorly, especially the GFS in forecasting hurricanes 2 weeks out. I had to make that correction to some of the subscribers and call it out within our Energy Rogue platform, because there was a lot of buzz and I had a lot of questions from folks about, is there any validity to this? It never even happened, right?
Well, it's kind of, if you took today and then you go, say, 14 days in the future, the range of outcomes is significant, and the range of outcomes gets smaller and smaller the closer you get. In other words, the range of outcomes today for 14, it's like predicting what S&P 500 is going to be, because you have an algo program 14 days from now. Guess what? It doesn't exist. It's a fool's errand. Now, that said, you can look at the statistics and say, if everything is normalized and the model does not change the hundreds of inputs that go into the modeling, then it'll happen and it'll hit Florida. But those hundreds of variables have to line up the right way from the initial modeling. Is that a fair way of assessing it?
110%, Brian, because you're only as good as your data. And one other comment I'm going to add to that in short is, when we were having conversations several weeks ago about potential cuts to NOAA and the implications on the model output, it has everything to do not with the next 14 days, but the next 3 to 5. Because between, say, day today and maybe 3 days from now, we're feeding off of observed data that's then being fed into the weather models and is then providing an output based on the observed. Right. And if we limit our observed, well, now our forecast becomes less accurate than it would be. So it is all in the data. Same thing in the world of AI. Garbage in, garbage out. You're only as good as your data.
Well, I think the key is, and I can bring a say that 10 times fast, real world example.
Yeah, exactly, brother.
I know. Which is right before Israel and Iran escalated and started firing rockets back at one another, I projected that oil would be at $50. Well, of course, those are two variables, two different countries that now have escalated the risk level, meaning my projection was off, but that's because of a very important variable that has a high importance factor. And so when you look at all these factors, now you're talking about 100. I may even be underestimating how many different variables go into this. I'm saying 100, might be 1,000, and any 5 of them could take the forecast off significantly. It's the reason everybody complains about the weather guy on TV who says it's going to be sunny out and then it rains. Every day here in Colorado, this happened over the weekend on Father's Day. It's going to be sunny all day on Father's Day. Nope. At noon, it started rolling in, and then we had storms. Just going to happen. So, and that forecast was the day ahead. So it's just part of statistic modeling. And just because this goes for AI, this goes for regression analysis or any machine learning, realize just because it told you that doesn't mean it's going to happen. There's still hundreds of different factors. And when you get into markets, throw in human factors, and it's a fair game every single day. So
So,
anyway,
Brendan, I also noticed that there's about 200 different models of weather models that are out there, and it's the top popular 200. There's more than 200, but it's top popular 200. Most of them follow a lot of the same parameters, and that's when you see it's sort of, to me, it's sort of like when they draw the probability chart of where the hurricane's going to go. There's a lot of different lines, but the majority
Yeah.
are all within one deal. But there's always a couple outliers. From time to time, those guys guess it right, and I'm going to call it guess because I don't think they knew, but I'm going to call it guess it right. And so it lands outside of that. And it's like any prediction of any weather event, the closer you get to it, the more accurate you're going to be. And because I remember even as young here in Oklahoma, when we predict tornadoes, I mean, it was like, well, there's going to be one here, there's going to be one here. Now we tell you what time it's going to arrive at what cross street. I mean,
Yeah.
the information has gotten so much better in the digital age. And so when we start looking at this, and folks, the reason we like Brendan is because we sort of sit down and talked about what the weather has effect on oil and gas. And very few meteorologists even attempt to do that. And Brendan's been patient with us as we explain things, and he's brings it to our membership, to our subscriber set, at a level that we all can understand, and we begin to use that information. And so we really do appreciate what you do, Brendan. It's been pretty awesome to sit down and talk to you about this stuff. I mean,
right.
obviously, I live in Oklahoma. I mean, weather is like our third top subject we talk about every day, and
Of course.
so
Yeah.
and really, and we have just as many opinions as we do as people, just about. And so when we look at this and we start looking at this, I think some of the things that I learned from you early on was what the definition of a normal was. Because a lot of people, when they say normal, they think, well, in the last 3 years, well, then this is now above normal. Well, no, normal is a much longer time period in the weather world than what we imagine. And in fact is the last 3 years are not calculated into the normal number that we're seeing today. And so
Yeah.
that's why people don't understand some of the technology, and that's why we really appreciate you coming on and explaining some of that stuff.
No, of course. And I'll also just kind of chime in on a couple of things you said, really important. You talked first about the weather models, right? And there are plenty out there. And there's even private companies that are developing their own and using their own satellite, data and feeding it into their models respectfully. And the important thing, and I think the beauty of the conversations that I have with folks within the Rogue Edge platform and Energy Rogue as a whole, and with you guys as well, is that you have to not just look at the data, but you have to also understand the holistics, right? So let's actually walk through this together. Brian, do you mind pulling up that CDD map, that GFS chart you had?
Oh, this one?
Really good. Yes, perfect. So the GFS model, for example, it is looking at the big picture, right? So the GFS and the European model, these models that go out 2 weeks, they're really trying to assess the broader pattern. And yes, it does provide temperature. It does derive for you if it's going to get hotter or colder. But the reality is it's doing it on a resolution that's a little bit more blurred, so to speak. And it's because the model is trying to resolve broader scale changes as opposed to the coarse scale changes, within like a kilometer, right?
Right.
So in the case of the GFS, look, this is a very useful chart. But the important thing to also add is that for cooling degree days, it might actually be underdoing it. And as a matter of fact, if you look at that spike by the time we get to the 25th, if we were to look at some of these short-term models like the NAM, the HRRR that go out maybe a couple of days, they are responsible for helping to resolve the specifics on temperature, on heat. So it does show the spike. That's awesome. And that's great. And this is something that we like to leverage. At the same time, it's also important to note from a model standpoint that it's probably underdoing the CDD, and it's probably going to be even higher, right? Especially given the pattern that we're going to be experiencing across much of east of the Great Divide, central and eastern United States, pretty much through probably the middle of July, between now and the middle of July. So that is the key distinction when we talk about forecasting, guys, and for everybody watching, is you can't just look at the data. The data is great, and this is an amazing chart. You have to leverage the strengths and the weaknesses of the models respectfully. And Bill, to your point, if there's models that are giving you junk output, don't put a lot of weight into it, right? Toss it.
Well, in other words, listen to everything, but also use your individual brain. Don't rely on just AI. Don't rely on something because a model told you to do that, because that gets into a scary place. And honestly, if you stare at models too long, you're going to start putting your faith in a lot of things, and you're going to start saying things like,
I know a lot about sharks.
So
bingo.
That's
Exactly.
I want to believe as he does.
that's a great movie. Okay, so let's touch on this before we kind of wrap up, because we're trying to be a little bit more honed on this, because I know when we started our live streams, we would ramble on for like an hour. We're trying to keep it a little lighter. So hurricane season, more active and a lot of intensity. And that means that people that are watching oil and gas need to pay attention and need to stay on top of it. One way that they could do that is join Rogue Radar. And if you join Rogue Edge, you're actually invited to Brendan's office hours that he has with our team. And he has an open call, and you can ask weather questions and content and that type of thing. But one of the other factors that we're looking at is power, because power generation from natural gas has risen the last 3 years significantly, And we have got mixed forecasts, because some are expecting solar to start eking into natural gas usage this year for power. However, this is what I'm really concerned about. Is previous, you would see higher winter time or shoulder month time, but I'm looking at this dip right here, which is typically May, right there, and we just dropped below it. May was a very soft month for demand. However, that's given me a little bit of pause, because if we were to follow this trajectory, that we're looking at another 2 BCF a day of growth, which dramatically skews a lot of the modeling for storage. If we add that 2 BCF a day of demand for natural gas, which depends on two things: weather and renewables. So when we're looking at weather for the summer, we're sitting in June. We haven't really had intense heat yet, but is it coming? What do you think? Because it does depend on those two things for natural gas. Heat, how much heat we're going to have, how much AC load. What are your thoughts there, Brendan?
Yeah, I think the critical point is the next 2 weeks, if not the next month.
Okay.
Like I kind of teed off when we were talking about the Gulf. We are expecting high pressure to really build across much of the eastern half of the United States. And long-range guidance continues to show that be pretty oppressive for not just, the central and the south central, Texas and Illinois and Chicago, Dallas. We're also talking about New York City.
Okay.
So really, we're not just going to be talking about temperatures, but also very high humidity. So really, the next 3 weeks, it is going to be quite oppressive for a large part of the country.
Okay. And that's,
I think,
I mean, you're talking about the
100
biggest
start entering our
demand
forecast.
centers. Yeah, you're talking about the biggest demand centers. Sorry, Bill, I cut you off.
I would say we just started seeing 100 degrees starting into our 10-day forecast.
Yeah. And by the way, the heat indices are likely going to be into the hundreds for places like New York City, Chicago, probably even down to Miami. I mean, again, we're talking, to Bill's point, large population centers. Dallas, too, is finally getting it on the heat. We had a really, as you mentioned, Brian, similar to nat gas, we also had a soft start to summer. It was rather, kind of choppy. It wasn't, a huge surge in temps. And actually, one of the questions that I got frequently was, are we going to have summer, right? Because the first couple of weeks, it didn't look like it. And one of the things we had forecasted I'm proud of is very early on, that high pressure forming. We caught that in the models pretty early on last week and kind of gave a heads up to the current subscriber base. And sure enough, that has now culminated into what will likely be, I hate to say it, but maybe one of the worst heat waves we've seen for a large chunk of the country, probably in years.
Wow.
So it's a pretty significant. I'm getting a little bit kind of maybe jumping off the ledge too soon, or speaking before I should. But considering the trends we've seen in the models and the uptrending of the high pressure, considering the fact that it's already here and we're seeing it kind of overperform, that leads me to believe that it's going to be a pretty significant heat wave.
And remember, next Friday is Hawaiian Shirt Day.
Oh, you're going to need that for a while. And so I'll say, I mean, this is a heat wave that could last well into the middle of July. It's that.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's going to cover a lot of the country. That's the big part.
Exactly. Yep.
Do you think it is going to, relative to, say, the last, when I look at these years, 2022, 23, 24, do you think this heat wave is like, oh my gosh, it is significantly different than those years? And I know that's a loaded question because you're not staring at a model, but just based upon your big brain and what you remember.
I would say, going back the last couple of years, based on coverage, this will likely be the most expansive heat wave we've seen in years. In terms of it being necessarily hotter, I mean, I think it's going to be pretty much on par. But when we think about high pressure, this same, what we call ring of fire, right, that sets up every June and July, we usually see that confined to places like Texas and Oklahoma, and even out towards the Four Corner states. But we're seeing this expand for much of the eastern United States, which is, I would say, above, kind of overperforming what I would typically expect for a high pressure like this. So I will also add, last couple of years, we see it kind of expand like an accordion and contract, right? Mm-hmm. So we saw times where it expanded up to Chicago and then contracted back to Texas. This time, it's a large chunk of the country, which is
going to be everywhere.
Yeah, mostly. Yeah.
I mean, because you said Texas, I don't know if you said Illinois, Indiana, all
Midwest. Oh, yeah.
And then over to New York. I mean, you're talking about all the population centers that really drive a lot of the power demand.
And for a more concrete reference point, guys, anywhere east of the Rockies, I mean, it's fair game. Yeah, it's pretty large area we're talking about.
Okay. All right. If I'm 3 miles east of the Rockies, am I in trouble? I'm technically east of the Rockies, but I'm not that far. So
I guess by default you would be. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
Yeah. Well, so Brian, so you probably
pick up the phone and start dialing.
Well, listen, Brendan, thank you so much. I really appreciate the insight that you've provided. And listen, if you are out there and you're trying to figure out the energy markets, energyrogue.com, we've got your back. And just come join Rogue Radar as a start, or Rogue Edge if you really want to interact and really talk to energy experts like Bill and myself, and weather experts like Brendan. I mean, and then our Discord group is filled with institutional traders from around the world. We got 5 different continents, and these are incredibly bright people. So listen, come join us. We look forward to seeing you inside. I think that's all I got. Bill, Brendan, do y'all have any other thoughts or questions? Should we question? Should we ponder?
The only thing that I'm pondering.
But I will let you guys know that. Go ahead.
No, go first. No, you first.
I'm saying Brendan every now and then will weigh in on European weather, which is something that a lot of people don't talk about. And we talk about it because of the European natural gas storage is important for the LNG traffic. And so we bring that all the way back to the U.S. as far as what that weather impact has on the natural gas business.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, that was way better than what I was going to say. I was actually going to ask if the kiddie pool is out in your backyard.
Hey,
that was
listen,
my burning question.
That kiddie pool, if it was out, it'd be full for sure with all the rain. But folks, listen, this is what, you know, we get together. We always have a lot of fun.
That's what we do.
You know, it's that's what we do.
Well, listen, folks, thanks so much. Really appreciate you coming. Brendan, thank you for giving us your valuable time. Really appreciate it. And listen, we will see you next week, and we'll have more weather. Drop us a comment, drop us a question, and because we do monitor that. So drop us a comment, drop us a question, and we'll get back to you. So listen, thanks so much for joining us today, and we will see you next week.